With the new year having come and gone and us rapidly approaching the midway point of the season, it's safe to say that this has been quite an interesting year thus far for more than a few players and teams in both good and bad ways. In the East, we've seen the latest example of the super team experiment backfiring horribly for the Sixers, whose big three has barely been able to make it onto the court, leaving the rest of the team to sink to the bottom of the conference. And this failure is being made even worse by the way that the Orlando Magic, who have similarly been ravaged by injuries, have still managed to maintain a top 5 seed while seeing contributions in an established culture of grit helping them to not only survive in turmoil, but thrive in it. And shifting over to the West, the bottom of the conference is a strange mix of the usual suspects in the Cooper Flag sweepstakes, along with some surprisingly bad teams who we've been expecting to take the next step, but have found themselves struggling for any number of reasons. The first team that may come to mind is probably the Sacramento Kings, who had a very public and very abrupt separation from their head coach. But the more interesting case to me has been the New Orleans Pelicans. Because for the longest time, every storyline related to this team has revolved around Zion and how his injuries have constantly derailed their progress. And unfortunately, while that hasn't really changed this year, I feel like the focus purely on Zion and his failures has hidden some of the more positive, if you can even call it that, aspects of the Pelicans' failure, particularly in the glimpses of greatness that a few players have shown this season as the team has struggled. And while multiple players are worthy of a video, whether it be on the career scoring year that Trey Murphy's been having, or the rebounding dominance of rookie Yves Missi, the subtle Brandon Boston emergence that's been happening has been far more interesting to me for a bunch of different reasons. Especially when you consider the status that he's held since high school and the various obstacles he's had to navigate through while facing a whirlwind of superstardom and limited opportunity, we can gain a lot from looking at his career and how he's been able to find a role in New Orleans this year. So let's talk about Brandon Boston and how you salvage a star. For the past 5 years or so, it feels like Brandon Boston was on track to become just the latest instance of a high school superstar that failed to translate. And it was pretty rough to see, because if you did have a chance to watch him in high school, this seemed like an unimaginable outcome. The 6'6" wing was, of course, yet another member of the 2020 class that I keep finding a way to mention, and he similarly garnered a lot of attention for a smooth game and size at the 2-guard position. Boston played the majority of his high school ball at Norcross in Georgia, helping to put the Georgia basketball scene on the map alongside his friend and AAU teammate Sharif Cooper, and even had some legendary battles with Anthony Edwards prior to him leaving for college. And for a senior year, Boston would transfer to Sierra Canyon, helping to build a super team that featured Zaire Williams, Zaire Wade, and a young Bronny James, which garnered a lot of attention from scouts and social media outlets alike. And the move would work out wonderfully for Boston at the time. He'd average 19.7 points and 7 rebounds, help lead Sierra Canyon to a 30-4 record, and pile up accolades like the California Mr. Basketball Award, making it into every All-American game you can think of, and finishing as a consensus top 10 ranked player across every major recruiting outlet, ultimately choosing to play at Kentucky as their highest rated prospect in the class of 2020. So I say all that to say, coming out of high school, Boston's game was undeniable and left many people with high expectations for a monster one-and-done year at Kentucky and an even more dominant pro career. But instead, Boston stumbled right out the gate, with his time at Kentucky being far less glamorous than people were expecting, as he struggled to not only beat his man off the dribble, but also lost that 3-level scoring and shooting touch that everyone was so sure of throughout his time in high school. He only averaged 11.5 points per game and 4.5 rebounds, shooting 35.5% from the field and 30% from 3 while being nearly non-existent on the defensive end, only tallying 4 blocks for the entire season. This lackluster year, though, didn't deter Boston from declaring for the draft alongside his Kentucky teammate and fellow high school hoops legend Terrence Clark. And despite their poor college production, their potential and superstar reputation not only earned them representation by Clutch Sports, but also got them a documentary series that covered their draft process and workouts as they headed towards their pro careers. And for starters, I'd really recommend checking out the documentary because it's really insightful and does a great job of capturing the pressures and intricacies of the draft process and does an excellent job memorializing Terrence Clark. But the move to make a documentary, especially at this point in Boston's career, is worthy of examination. Boston was still being viewed as enough of a draw and a sure bet in the league that even after a year that would force most freshmen to consider staying another season, he earned a documentary series based purely on that potential and the gamble that his scoring and game would eventually work out. And while it's far from unusual for a freshman to still be highly touted after a bad college season, the move to still make a documentary on Boston's process feels representative of the way that basketball stardom and cult-like fandom can cause people to overlook certain glaring shortcomings in their game in order to capitalize on the brands that these players have been building without considering the long-term consequences or scenarios for failure that can arise for these hyped-up talents. Regardless, scouts were still enamored by Boston's scoring potential and remained confident in his shooting mechanics, while interestingly taking care to note that they didn't see him developing into an elite defender for his career. And ultimately, Boston ended up being drafted in the second round to the Grizzlies and traded to the Clippers. Now, the circumstances surrounding his rookie year were extremely emotional, as his friend and fellow Kentucky teammate T. Clark tragically passed away before the draft, rocking the hoops world and shaking Boston to his core, and giving him every reason to have a rocky rookie year, and to be quite honest, his numbers reflected that, only serving to exacerbate the concerns about Boston's ability to play in the league. He averaged 6.7 points and 2.2 rebounds a game on 38.5% shooting from the field and 30.6% shooting from three. Numbers that don't jump off the page and mirror the inefficient shooting that he'd shown at Kentucky. But Boston was able to have a few bright spots throughout the COVID and injury-riddled season that Clippers had, with the main one coming on December 8th, where he scored a career-high 27 points to go along with 4 steals in a breakout performance that he'd dedicate to his late friend Terrence Clark. But moments like these for Boston were few and far in between, with his rookie year being spent mostly on the bench, unable to crack the deep Clippers wing rotation. However, he did also have a few stints in the G League where he was able to showcase that the player that was so highly touted coming out of high school was still alive in him somewhere. In the 9 games that Boston played in the G League his rookie year, he absolutely lit up the stat sheet, averaging 20.9 points and 4.7 rebounds on 47.1% shooting from the field and 44% shooting from 3. But the real revelation for this season was the 1.6 steals that Boston would average, indicating to anyone who was able to pay attention that the defensive versatility that had been questioned and projected to come far later in his development may not have been as far away as we initially thought. But regardless, Boston's rookie year would end with nearly all of the hype and optimism that surrounded him pretty much fading away for the wider NBA fan base. And going into the 22-23 year, Clippers fans not only didn't expect him to take a leap, they didn't expect him to spend any time on the main roster, instead predicting that he'd go down to the G League where he'd once again be dominant. And these predictions ultimately ended up being correct, with his sophomore NBA season being relatively non-existent, while he took a major leap in the G League, eventually winning the 2022 G League Showcase MVP and averaging 28.6 points while helping to lead the Agua Caliente Clippers to a G League Showcase Cup championship. But aside from the rare Clippers blog or update tweet about the showcase, this accomplishment received no acclaim or press, and Boston's failure to make it onto the court for the Clippers saw him continue to fade away from the minds of the fans and scouts who had been so sure of his potential as a scorer and high-level guard in the NBA. And that lack of acclaim and inability to crack the Clippers rotation would ultimately continue through the 23-24 season, with him receiving DNP after DNP and ultimately not getting a qualifying offer, leading to him becoming an unrestricted free agent at season's end on the fast track to being out of the league at just 22 years old. Now, to pause for a bit, the rapid decline of Boston's public perception from highly touted Hollywood prospect to relatively obscure failed young player is not an unusual occurrence and has become quite normalized for prospects in the social media age. But Boston's case is particularly interesting because he had managed to develop a great deal in the G, but was still unable to receive any opportunities or press thanks to the very public, superstar-chasing, disappointment-riddled approach the Clippers were taking, and the wildly trumped-up expectations that we had for Boston that wouldn't acknowledge any outcome for his career other than superstardom. The player who had been seen as a surefire, 3-level scorer, bringing a lot of hype into college and the draft, had quickly been demoted into a 3-and-D project player with no chance for development in the NBA and all signs of development in the G being outright ignored. And at this point, Boston's career was quite literally on its last leg, with the Pelicans acquiring him off waivers and signing him to a 2-way contract, where he was being viewed as just another body in case injuries came up during the season. But while everyone would have imagined this scenario to play out just as his tenure with the Clippers did, with an extremely deep wing team not needing Boston, injuries would decimate the roster and clear the way for Boston to have a breakout year in an unimaginable way. Throughout the season, Boston's been one of the only consistently available players for the Pelicans, playing in nearly every game this year for the team, and putting up a career-high 11.8 points on 44% shooting from the field and 35% shooting from 3, to go along with 3.4 rebounds and 2.8 assists, numbers that on their own may not be very impressive. But for the first time in his basketball career, the offensive end of the ball is not what's been bringing him attention, and instead his consistent ability to compete on defense has turned more than a few heads this season. Boston's been averaging a career-high 1.5 steals this year, and finds himself in the 90th percentile of steal percentage among forwards, sitting at 2.2% as of January 1st. Furthermore, from October 30th to December 19th, he put together a 19-game streak of recording at least a steal, which led the league. And all of that is on top of Boston being third on the team in defensive win shares, below only Yves Missi and DeJounte Murray, and having a career year from the mid-range, shooting 46.4%, and giving Pels fans and people who'd been following him since high school hope that that 3-level scorer is still alive in Boston. And even though it hasn't received a lot of mainstream attention, this offensive and defensive emergence has shifted the narrative of Boston's career from being simply a 2-way fill-in player to the Pelicans literally scrambling to figure out how they can convert him to a standard NBA contract and keep him through the season. And it's that rapidly shifting narrative on Boston's career that really intrigues me, because it's the type of story you never really hear about from these highly touted guys who struggle along the way in their development. So often, for players like Boston, who were highly touted and received superstar level acclaim before playing a possession of NBA basketball, there's a very boomer bust perception of their potential as a player. If their track of development doesn't seem to be instantly heading towards the NBA superstardom that fans and media had expected of them since high school, they essentially vanish into the ether as just another failed prospect that everyone was wrong about. The constant cameras and docuseries and inflated expectations for these guys set them up for failure from the start, and established the idea that for a player of Boston's caliber and clout, to become a 3-and-D wing is to fail and fumble the talent that we all know they have. But Boston's development this year, through a mixture of pure luck and G League repetition, should serve as an example of what it looks like for a social media superstar to truly grow and profile their game to change the narrative and hopefully find a long-term role in the NBA. So for the Pelicans fans who are struggling through yet another wasted season defined by injuries, that's tough, I'm not gonna lie. But don't beat yourselves up too much, because you guys have managed to find a diamond in the rough and salvage a star. But with all that being said, that's gonna do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully I can catch you in the next one.